Lady Eleanor Ashworth had always been known for her unwavering principles and sharp tongue. At 62, she carried herself with the dignity befitting her position as the Queen's sister, yet possessed a warmth that endeared her to both staff and family alike. The autumn morning sun filtered through the grand windows of Whitmore Palace as she made her way through the marble corridors, her sensible heels clicking against the polished floor with determined precision. The palace buzzed with its usual morning activity. Servants hurried past with silver trays, their uniforms pristine, and movements practiced from years of royal service. Eleanor nodded to each familiar face, remembering their names and occasionally inquiring about their families. This personal touch had earned her tremendous loyalty among the staff, something that would prove invaluable in the days to come. As she approached the Queen's private sitting room, Eleanor noticed an unusual tension in the air. Guards stood more rigidly at their posts, and the usual cheerful chatter among the younger staff members was notably absent. Something was amiss, though. She couldn't quite place what it was. Catherine Cambridge Wells, the Crown Princess, emerged from the sitting room just as Eleanor arrived. At 38, Catherine possessed an elegant beauty that photographers loved to capture, but today her usually composed demeanor seemed strained. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her navy dress was immaculate as always. Yet there was something in her green eyes that suggested trouble. "Eleanor," Catherine said, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I was hoping to speak with you." "Of course, my dear," Eleanor replied, studying the younger woman's face with the keen eye of someone who had spent decades navigating royal politics. "Shall we take tea in the Blue Room? It's more private there." The Blue Room was one of Eleanor's favorite spaces in the palace. Decorated in soft blues and golds, it offered a sense of intimacy that the grander rooms lacked. As they settled into the comfortable armchairs near the window, Eleanor poured tea from the delicate Wedgwood service, noting how Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she accepted her cup. "What's troubling you, Catherine?" Eleanor asked directly. She had never been one for dancing around issues. Catherine set down her teacup with a small clink. "It's about Thomas," she said quietly, referring to Prince Thomas Mountbatten, the Queen Consort's son from her first marriage. "His behavior has become increasingly problematic." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. Thomas, now 28, had always been something of a wild card in the royal family. Unlike his stepbrother, the Crown Prince, Thomas had no clear role or responsibility, which often led to restlessness and poor judgment. His mother, Queen Consort Isabel, had always been protective of him, perhaps too much so. "In what way?" Eleanor inquired, though she suspected she knew the direction this conversation was heading. Catherine glanced toward the door, ensuring they were truly alone. "He's been making inappropriate comments about my position, about my marriage to James. Yesterday, during the charity luncheon, he suggested in front of several board members that I was unsuitable for my role. He implied that my background wasn't refined enough for the crown." Eleanor felt a familiar fire ignite in her chest. Catherine came from a respected but non-aristocratic family, something that had initially caused some raised eyebrows when she married Crown Prince James 7 years ago. However, she had proven herself time and again to be graceful, intelligent, and completely dedicated to her royal duties. "What exactly did he say?" Eleanor asked, her voice carefully controlled. "He said that some people need to remember their place, and that breeding tells." When Lady Pemberton asked him to clarify, he looked directly at me and said that not everyone is born to wear a crown. The words hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt her jaw tighten. She had witnessed similar situations throughout her life in the royal family, and she knew that allowing such behavior to continue unchecked would only embolden Thomas further. "Has James spoken to him?" Eleanor asked, referring to Catherine's husband, the Crown Prince. Catherine shook her head. "James was in Scotland at the Veterans event. He doesn't know yet. I wasn't sure how to handle it. Thomas is his stepbrother, and with Isabel being so protective, Eleanor understood the delicate position Catherine found herself in. Queen Consort Isabel had married into the family 15 years ago, bringing with her a son from her previous marriage. While she had adapted well to royal life, she remained fiercely protective of Thomas, often making excuses for his behavior and shielding him from consequences. "You did right to tell me," Eleanor said firmly. This behavior is unacceptable regardless of Thomas's relationship to the family. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of raised voices echoed from the corridor outside. Eleanor and Catherine exchanged glances before Eleanor rose and moved toward the door. She opened it slightly, listening to the commotion. "I don't care what protocol says," came Thomas's voice, sharp and entitled. "I'm family. I have every right to access those rooms." "Sir, I'm afraid those are the Crown Princess's private quarters. Without her express permission," the guard's voice was professional but firm. "Oh, please. Since when does she get to make decisions about palace access?" "My mother is the queen consort." Eleanor's eyes flashed. She had heard enough. Turning back to Catherine, she found the younger woman looking pale but resolute. "It seems Thomas is providing us with a perfect opportunity to address this situation," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the steel that had made her formidable in diplomatic circles. Catherine stood, straightening her shoulders. "What do you suggest?" "We're going to have a conversation with Thomas, one that will make it very clear what behavior is acceptable in this family and what is not." As they prepared to leave the Blue Room, Eleanor placed a gentle but firm hand on Catherine's arm. "Remember, my dear, you are not just Catherine Cambridge Wells anymore. You are the future queen. You have not only the right but the responsibility to command respect." The two women walked purposefully toward the sound of the continuing argument. As they rounded the corner, they could see Thomas facing off with two of the palace guards. He was a handsome young man with dark hair and the Mountbatten blue eyes, but his expression was petulant and demanding. He wore an expensive suit that seemed chosen more for making a statement than appropriateness, and his posture radiated entitlement. "Thomas," Eleanor called out, her voice carrying the authority of decades in royal service. He turned toward her, his expression shifting slightly as he recognized her. "Aunt Eleanor," he said, though the title was more courtesy than blood relation. "Perhaps you can talk sense into these guards. They're refusing to allow me access to areas of my own family's home." Eleanor moved closer, her gaze steady and unwavering. Catherine flanked her, silent but present, her very stillness conveying strength. "These are not your family's private quarters, Thomas," Eleanor said clearly. "They belong to the Crown Princess, and as I understand it, you were not invited." Thomas's face flushed slightly. "Since when do I need an invitation to move freely in the palace where my mother lives? Since you began conducting yourself in a manner that shows disrespect for the dignity of this institution and the people within it," Eleanor replied without hesitation. The guards, clearly uncomfortable but maintaining their posts, watched the exchange with professional attention. Eleanor was aware that this conversation was being witnessed, and she intended to use that fact to her advantage. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he looked between Eleanor and Catherine. "I see. And I suppose you're here as her champion?" "I'm here as someone who has served this family for over 40 years and will not stand by while anyone, regardless of their connections, undermines the respect and authority that position demands." The tension in the corridor was palpable. Other staff members had begun to gather at a respectful distance, sensing that something significant was occurring. Eleanor knew that how this moment played out would send a message throughout the entire palace about what behavior would be tolerated. Thomas crossed his arms, his stance defiant. "And what exactly are you suggesting I've done wrong? I simply made some observations about suitability and breeding at a charity event. Surely that's not a crime." Catherine spoke for the first time since joining the confrontation. "It wasn't just observations, Thomas. It was a deliberate attempt to undermine my position and authority in front of people who depend on clear leadership from the royal family." Her voice was steady, but Eleanor could hear the underlying strength that had been building throughout their conversation. This was exactly what Catherine needed, an opportunity to stand her ground and establish her authority. Thomas laughed, but it was a harsh sound. "Authority? You've been in this family for what, 7 years? Some of us have been here much longer." "Length of time doesn't grant anyone the right to be disrespectful," Eleanor interjected, "and it certainly doesn't excuse behavior that reflects poorly on the entire family." "Mother won't stand for this," Thomas said, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "She won't appreciate you ganging up on her son." Eleanor stepped closer to him, her height and bearing making her seem even more imposing. "Your mother is a wonderful woman who has earned her place in this family through grace and dedication. Don't dishonor her by hiding behind her position when your own actions are indefensible." The words hit their mark. Thomas's confident facade wavered slightly, and for a moment, Eleanor saw not the entitled young man, but someone who was perhaps more insecure than he wanted to admit. But the moment passed quickly, and Thomas's expression hardened again. "We'll see what she has to say about this." As he turned to leave, Eleanor called after him, "Thomas." He paused but didn't turn around. "Tomorrow morning you will provide a written apology to Princess Catherine for your behavior at the charity luncheon. You will also personally apologize to Lady Pemberton and the other board members who witnessed your comments." Now he did turn around, his face flushed with anger. "You can't order me to do anything." "No," Eleanor agreed calmly, "but I can make it very clear to your mother, to the Queen, and to anyone else who asks that your continued presence at official royal events depends on your ability to conduct yourself appropriately." The threat was clear and effective. Thomas's position in the royal family was already somewhat precarious due to his lack of official duties. Any formal complaint about his behavior could result in his exclusion from important events, something that would devastate both him and his mother. For several long moments, the corridor was silent, except for the distant sounds of palace life continuing around them. Finally, Thomas nodded curtly and walked away, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Eleanor turned to Catherine, noting the color that had returned to the younger woman's cheeks. "How do you feel?" "Stronger," Catherine admitted. "Thank you for standing with me." "You stood yourself, my dear. I simply ensured you weren't standing alone." The guards who had witnessed the entire exchange maintained their professional expressions, but Eleanor caught a subtle nod of approval from the senior guard, Sergeant Morrison. She had worked with him for many years and knew that his respect was not easily earned. As they walked back toward the Blue Room, Eleanor reflected on what had just occurred. This was likely just the beginning of a larger conflict that would test the delicate balance of relationships within the royal family. Thomas's behavior suggested deeper issues that wouldn't be resolved with a single confrontation. "Do you think he'll actually apologize?" Catherine asked as they settled back into their chairs. Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I think he'll comply with the formal requirements. Whether the apology will be sincere is another matter entirely. But sometimes the act itself is more important than the sentiment behind it." "And Queen Consort Isabel, how do you think she'll react when Thomas tells her what happened?" This was the question Eleanor had been dreading. Isabel was a good woman, but her blind spot regarding her son's behavior had been growing more problematic over the years. She tended to interpret any criticism of Thomas as an attack on her own position in the family. "She'll be upset," Eleanor said honestly. "She'll likely see this as an attack on Thomas, rather than a natural consequence of his own actions." "We need to be prepared for that conversation." Catherine nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Should I speak with James before she has a chance to present her version of events?" "Absolutely. James needs to understand what happened from your perspective. He's been protective of family harmony, sometimes to a fault, but he won't tolerate disrespect toward you." As they discussed strategy for the upcoming family dynamics, Eleanor felt a sense of satisfaction. Catherine had shown real growth in this situation, moving from uncertainty to strength. But she also felt a gnawing concern about the broader implications of Thomas's behavior and the family divisions it might create. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the windows as their conversation continued. Outside, the palace gardens showed the first hints of autumn's arrival, with leaves beginning to turn gold and amber. It seemed fitting somehow. A season of change was upon them all. The next morning brought with it the kind of crisp autumn air that made the palace gardens sparkle with dew. Eleanor had risen early, as was her custom, and was taking her morning walk through the grounds when she encountered Sergeant Morrison near the east wing entrance. His usual composed demeanor seemed slightly strained, and she sensed he had something important to convey. "Good morning, Sergeant," she said, pausing in her walk. "You look as though you have something on your mind." Morrison glanced around to ensure they were alone before speaking. "Lady Eleonora, there was an incident last night that you should be aware of." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. In her experience, when palace security felt the need to inform family members of incidents, They were rarely trivial matters. What sort of incident? Prince Thomas returned to the palace quite late, around 2 in the morning. He was not entirely sober, ma'am. He attempted to access the Crown Princess's wing again, claiming he needed to settle matters with her. The implications of this information sent a chill through Eleanor. Intoxicated Thomas attempting to confront Catherine in the middle of the night represented exactly the kind of escalation she had feared. "I trust he was not successful in this attempt?" she asked, though her tone suggested she expected nothing less than complete prevention. "No, ma'am. The night guards followed protocol and denied him access." However, his behavior became increasingly agitated. He raised his voice considerably and made some rather unfortunate comments about the Crown Princess's character. Eleanor felt her jaw tighten. What sort of comments? Morrison hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with repeating what had been said. He suggested that her common origins made her unsuitable for royal life. He also implied that she had manipulated Prince James into marriage for social advancement. The words hung in the morning air like a challenge. Eleanor knew that such comments, even made in private to palace guards, had a way of spreading. The staff were loyal, but they were also human, and gossip had a life of its own within the palace walls. Who else was present during this incident? 3 guards total, ma'am. All experienced men who understand discretion. However, Morrison paused, looking even more uncomfortable. Yes? Prince Thomas made it clear that he intended to speak with Queen Consort Isabel this morning about yesterday's confrontation. He seemed quite confident that she would side with him. Eleanor nodded grimly. This was exactly what she had anticipated, but it still presented significant challenges. Isabel's protective instincts regarding Thomas often clouded her judgment about his behavior. "Thank you for informing me, Sergeant. Please ensure that the guards who witnessed last night's incident understand the importance of maintaining appropriate discretion while also being prepared to provide honest accounts if officially asked." "Understood, ma'am." As Eleanor continued her walk, her mind raced through the various scenarios that might unfold over the next few hours. Thomas's nocturnal visit to the palace represented a serious escalation of the situation. It suggested that her confrontation with him yesterday had not produced the sobering effect she had hoped for. Her contemplation was interrupted by the sight of Catherine emerging from a side door of the palace, also dressed for a morning walk. The Crown Princess wore a simple but elegant coat and had her hair pulled back in a casual style that somehow made her look both approachable and regal. "Eleanor!" Catherine called out, approaching with quick steps. "I was hoping to find you. James returned late last night from Scotland." "And you told him about the situation with Thomas?" Catherine nodded, her expression indicating that the conversation had been as difficult as expected. He was concerned and angry, though he tried to hide it. "He's protective of family harmony, as you said, but he won't tolerate disrespect toward me or undermining of my position." Eleanor was pleased to hear this, though she suspected James's position would be tested significantly in the coming hours. "There's something else you should know," Catherine continued. "Thomas apparently attempted to visit my quarters last night around 2 in the morning. The guards informed my security detail this morning. Yes, I've just learned about that incident myself. It suggests that Thomas is not taking yesterday's confrontation as the warning it was intended to be." Catherine's expression grew more serious. "James is furious about that. He said that attempting to confront me in private quarters in the middle of the night crosses every line of appropriate behavior." Eleanor felt a mix of relief and apprehension. James's strong reaction was exactly what the situation required, but it also meant that the family conflict was about to become much more intense. "Where is James now?" "He's meeting with his private secretary to discuss how to handle this formally. He's also planning to speak with his mother before Thomas has a chance to present his version of events." This was strategic thinking that Eleanor appreciated. Getting to Isabel first would allow for a more complete presentation of the facts before emotions became too heavily involved. As they walked together through the gardens, Eleanor noticed several staff members tending to the autumn flower beds. Their presence reminded her that palace life continued regardless of internal family conflicts, and that their behavior was constantly observed by people whose livelihoods depended on the stability of the royal household. "Catherine," Eleanor said thoughtfully, "I want to prepare you for what's likely to come next. When Thomas speaks with Isabel, she's going to be upset. She may see yesterday's confrontation as an attack on her son rather than a natural consequence of his behavior. Catherine nodded. James warned me about that. He said his mother has always had difficulty seeing Thomas's faults clearly. It's not entirely her fault, Eleanor said fairly. Thomas was quite young when she married into the family, and she felt enormous pressure to prove herself as a good mother to a royal stepson. That protectiveness served a purpose then, but it's become problematic as he's aged. They paused near a bench overlooking the palace's famous rose garden. Even in autumn, the garden retained its formal beauty, though the roses were past their peak bloom. "What do you think I should do when she confronts me?" Catherine asked. "Because she will, won't she?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. Isabel was generally a reasonable woman, but when it came to her son, her emotions often overrode her usual good judgment. "She will, and when she does, you must remain calm and factual. Don't allow the conversation to become emotional or personal. Stick to the specific incidents. What Thomas said at the charity luncheon, his attempt to access your private quarters without permission, and his behavior last night. And if she tries to minimize his actions or make excuses, then you hold your ground, politely but firmly. Remember, Catherine, you're not just defending yourself in these situations. You're establishing precedents for how the future queen will be treated by all members of the extended family." This seemed to resonate with Catherine, whose posture straightened slightly. Eleanor had noticed that framing situations in terms of Catherine's future role often helped the younger woman find her confidence. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a palace aide, who walked quickly across the garden toward them. Eleanor recognized him as one of the Queen's personal staff, which suggested that word of the situation had already reached the highest levels of the royal household. "Lady Eleanor, your Royal Highness," the aide said with a respectful bow. "Her Majesty requests your presence in her private study at your earliest convenience." Eleanor and Catherine exchanged glances. A summons to the Queen's private study was never casual, and the timing suggested that she had already been briefed on recent events. "Did Her Majesty indicate the nature of this meeting?" Eleanor asked. "No, ma'am, but Queen Consort Isabel is also expected to attend." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten slightly. A joint meeting with both the Queen and Isabel suggested that the situation had escalated to the level of formal family crisis management. "We'll attend immediately," Eleanor said. As the aide departed, Catherine turned to Eleanor with obvious anxiety. "Should I be concerned that I wasn't included in this summons?" Eleanor considered this. The Queen was extremely careful about protocol and family hierarchy. Her decision to meet with Eleanor and Isabel without Catherine suggested she wanted to hear from the senior family members first. "I think Her Majesty wants to understand the full scope of the situation before involving you directly. It's actually a sign of respect for your position. She doesn't want to put you in the position of defending yourself until she's had a chance to evaluate the facts independently." This seemed to ease Catherine's concerns somewhat. Will you represent my interests in that meeting?" Eleanor placed a gentle hand on Catherine's arm. "My dear, I will represent the truth, which, in this case, happens to align with your interests perfectly." As they walked back toward the palace, Eleanor's mind was already preparing for what promised to be a delicate and potentially explosive conversation. The Queen was fair but had little patience for family drama that threatened the stability of the institution. Isabel would likely come prepared to defend her son vigorously. And somewhere in the palace, Thomas was probably still sleeping off his late-night excesses, unaware that his behavior was about to be scrutinized at the highest levels. The morning sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows across the palace courtyards. Eleanor noticed that several members of the household staff had found reasons to be in areas where they might observe the comings and goings of family members. Word was spreading that something significant was happening, even if the exact details remained unclear. As they reached the main entrance to the palace, Catherine paused. "Eleanor, thank you for supporting me through this. I know it puts you in a difficult position with Isabel." Eleanor smiled, the expression carrying both warmth and determination. "Catherine, I've been navigating royal family politics for over 40 years. I learned long ago that the only way to maintain your integrity is to stand by what's right, regardless of who it might inconvenience." They parted ways in the main corridor, Catherine heading toward her own quarters and Eleanor making her way to the Queen's private study. As she walked through the familiar halls, Eleanor reflected on how much had changed since she first came to live in the palace as a young woman. The institution remained the same, but the personalities and dynamics evolved constantly. The Queen's private study was located in the oldest part of the palace, its walls lined with centuries of royal portraits and its furniture representing the best of British craftsmanship from multiple eras. Eleanor had spent countless hours in this room over the years, discussing everything from state affairs to family matters. As she approached the study, she could hear voices inside, the Queen's measured tones and Isabel's more animated responses. Eleanor paused for a moment to collect her thoughts before knocking. "Enter," came the Queen's voice. Eleanor opened the door to find Her Majesty seated behind the ornate desk that had served royal business for 3 generations. At 78, the Queen remained an imposing figure, her silver hair perfectly styled and her blue eyes sharp with intelligence. Isabel sat in one of the chairs facing the desk, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of stress. "Eleanor," the Queen said, "please join us." Isabel was just explaining her perspective on yesterday's incident. As Eleanor took her seat, she noted that Isabel's eyes were slightly red, suggesting she had been crying. Despite their disagreement about Thomas's behavior, Eleanor felt sympathy for the other woman's distress. "I've heard Isabel's account," the Queen continued, "and now I'd like to hear yours." Eleanor had always appreciated the Queen's direct approach to problem-solving. There would be no dancing around the issues or diplomatic niceties that obscured the truth. "Your Majesty, I believe the situation requires examination in its full context, beginning with Thomas's behavior at the charity luncheon and continuing through his actions last night." Isabel shifted in her chair, her expression defensive. Thomas may have been inappropriate in his comments, but the way he was confronted yesterday was humiliating. He's family, not some servant to be dressed down in front of the guards. Eleanor met Isabel's gaze steadily. Family members are not exempt from the requirements of respectful behavior, particularly when that behavior reflects on the institution we all serve. The Queen listened to this exchange without comment, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. Eleanor knew that she was being evaluated not just on her version of events, but on her judgment and reasoning.
"Tell me exactly what happened yesterday,"
the Queen said. Eleanor provided a detailed account of the confrontation, being careful to present Thomas's words and behavior accurately while also acknowledging the witnesses present. She concluded with the incident from last night, noting that the information came from palace security. "And your assessment of the seriousness of these incidents?" the Queen asked. "Your Majesty, taken individually, each incident might be dismissed as poor judgment. Taken together, they suggest a pattern of disrespectful behavior that threatens to undermine the authority of the crown princess and, by extension, the stability of the succession." Isabel's composure finally broke. "He's just a young man trying to find his place in this family. Everything has always been handed to James because he's the heir. Thomas has had to fight for every bit of recognition or respect." Eleanor felt genuine sympathy for Isabel's pain, but she couldn't allow it to excuse Thomas's behavior. "Isabel, I understand your protective instincts as a mother, but Thomas is 28 years old, not a child. His position in this family comes with privileges that most people could never dream of, but it also comes with responsibilities." The Queen raised a hand slightly, indicating that the discussion should pause. She turned to Isabel with the expression of someone who was about to deliver difficult news. "Isabel, I've known you for 15 years, and I've watched you adapt to royal life with grace and dedication. You've been an asset to this family in countless ways, but your son's behavior has become a problem that requires formal address." Isabel's face went pale. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Thomas will need to demonstrate that he can conduct himself appropriately, or his access to official royal functions will be restricted." The words hung in the air like a sentence. For someone in Thomas's position, exclusion from royal events would be both socially and personally devastating. "You can't punish him for defending himself," Isabel protested. Eleanor spoke carefully. "He wasn't defending himself, Isabel. He was attacking Catherine's character and position without provocation, and his behavior last night suggests that he hasn't learned from yesterday's conversation." The Queen stood, indicating that the meeting was moving toward its conclusion. "Thomas will be given the opportunity to apologize formally and to demonstrate better judgment going forward." If he chooses to do so, this matter can be resolved within the family. If he chooses not to, she left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. As the three women prepared to leave the study, Eleanor felt both relief and apprehension. The Queen's position was clear and appropriate, but implementing it would require careful navigation of family loyalties and emotions.
Isabel paused at the door, turning back to Eleanor.
I hope you understand what this will do to my son. Eleanor met her gaze with compassion but no compromise. I hope Thomas understands what his own behavior has already done to his position in this family. The afternoon following the Queen's meeting brought an unsettling quiet to the palace corridors. Eleanor had spent the morning hours in her private sitting room, handling correspondence and attempting to maintain some semblance of normalcy while the royal household processed the morning's dramatic developments. The weight of the situation pressed upon her shoulders, but she had learned over the decades that maintaining composure during family crises was essential for everyone's stability. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, setting aside the letter she had been writing to a charity patron. To her surprise, Crown Prince James entered the room. At 42, he possessed the kind of bearing that commanded respect without effort. His dark hair showed the first touches of gray at the temples, and his blue eyes carried both intelligence and the weight of future kingship. Today, however, those eyes also showed the strain of family conflict. "James," Eleanor said, rising to greet him. "This is an unexpected pleasure, Aunt Eleanor," he said, using the familial title that had never quite felt natural given their lack of blood relation but had become habit over the years. "I wanted to speak with you privately about the situation with Thomas." Eleanor gestured to the comfortable seating area near the window, where afternoon light created a warm atmosphere despite the gravity of their conversation. "I've spoken with Catherine about everything that's happened," James began as they settled into their chairs. "I want you to know how grateful I am that you stood with her yesterday. She needed that support, and I wasn't here to provide it." Eleanor studied his expression, noting the guilt that seemed to weigh on him. "James, you cannot be everywhere at once. Your duties to the crown sometimes require you to be away from family situations. Perhaps, but Catherine is my responsibility, and more than that, she's my wife." "What Thomas did?" James's voice hardened, questioning her character in public, attempting to access her quarters uninvited, making those comments to the guards. "It's completely unacceptable." Eleanor was pleased to hear the steel in his voice. James had always been diplomatic by nature, sometimes to a fault, but this situation required clear leadership from him. "What's your plan for addressing this with Thomas directly?" James leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That's what I wanted to discuss with you. Mother spoke with me after her meeting with you and the Queen this morning. She's devastated. She feels that Thomas is being unfairly targeted." Eleanor sighed softly. Isabel's reaction was predictable but problematic. What specifically does she believe is unfair? She thinks that Catherine could have handled the charity luncheon situation more diplomatically. She believes that confronting Thomas publicly was unnecessarily harsh. Eleanor felt a familiar flash of irritation. Catherine didn't confront Thomas publicly. Thomas made his comments publicly. The confrontation occurred when he attempted to override palace security protocols. "I know that," James said quickly, "and I've made that clear to Mother. But she's asking me to consider Thomas's position in the family, and whether there might be alternative ways to address his behavior." Eleanor studied James carefully. She could see the conflict in his expression, the duty to support his wife warring with his desire to maintain family harmony and his affection for his stepmother. "James, what alternative do you think might be appropriate for a 28-year-old man who publicly questioned your wife's suitability to be queen?" The directness of the question seemed to clarify something for James. His expression firmed, and Eleanor saw the future king emerging from behind the diplomatic prince. "You're right," he said. "There is no alternative. Thomas needs to apologize formally and change his behavior, or face the consequences grandmother outlined." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the corridor outside. Voices were raised, and Eleanor could hear the rapid footsteps of someone moving quickly through the palace. She and James exchanged glances before James rose and moved toward the door. Before he could reach it, the door burst open without a knock. Thomas Mountbatten stood in the doorway, his face flushed and his hair disheveled. He wore yesterday's clothes, wrinkled from sleep, and his eyes showed the lingering effects of too much alcohol and too little rest. "So this is where the conspiracy meeting is taking place," Thomas said, his voice carrying both hurt and anger. James straightened to his full height, and Eleanor could see the future king's authority settling over him like a cloak. "Thomas, you will knock before entering private rooms, and you will address us with appropriate respect," Thomas laughed, but it was a bitter sound. Respect? That's rich, coming from a family meeting designed to destroy my reputation. Eleanor rose from her chair, her own authority evident in her bearing. "Thomas, no one is trying to destroy your reputation. Your behavior is creating difficulties for your reputation entirely on its own." "My behavior?" Thomas's voice rose. "What about Catherine's behavior? What about her manipulation of this entire family?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Eleanor felt a cold fury building in her chest, but before she could respond, James stepped forward. "Stop right there, Thomas," James said, his voice carrying an edge Eleanor had rarely heard from him. "You will not speak about my wife in that manner. You will not question her character or her place in this family." Thomas turned to face his stepbrother fully, and Eleanor could see years of resentment and jealousy boiling to the surface. "Your wife," Thomas spat. "The commoner who married into royalty and now thinks she can order round people who are born to this life." Eleanor had heard enough. She moved between the two men, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Thomas Mountbatten," she said, her voice carrying the full weight of her decades in royal service, "you will stop this immediately. You are making accusations against the crown princess that are not only false but potentially treasonous." Thomas's eyes widened slightly at the word treasonous, but his anger seemed to override his caution. "Treasonous? For pointing out that she's not one of us? You are questioning the legitimacy of the future queen's marriage and position," Eleanor said coldly. "You are suggesting that our future monarch was manipulated into his choice of bride. Yes, Thomas, that approaches treasonous territory." James stepped closer to Thomas, and Eleanor could see that his diplomatic nature was giving way to something much more dangerous. "Thomas, you have 30 seconds to apologize for what you just said about Catherine, or you will be removed from this palace today." The threat was clear and serious. Eleanor knew that James had the authority to make good on it, and more importantly, that he was angry enough to do so. Thomas looked between James and Eleanor, seeming to realize for the first time that he had pushed the situation beyond the point of family tolerance. I didn't mean," he began, but his words trailed off. "You didn't mean what?" James pressed. "You didn't mean to question Catherine's character? You didn't mean to suggest she manipulated me? You didn't mean to imply that she's unworthy of her position?" Eleanor watched Thomas struggle with his response. She could see the young man's internal conflict, his pride warring with his recognition that he had gone too far. "I meant that she doesn't understand our world," Thomas said finally, his voice much quieter. "She doesn't understand what it's like to be born into this life, to have every move watched and judged." Eleanor felt a moment of sympathy for Thomas's obvious pain, but it couldn't excuse his behavior. "Thomas," she said gently, "Catherine has been part of this family for 7 years. She has dedicated herself to royal duties with grace and intelligence. She has earned her place through service, not birthright." "That's exactly the point," Thomas said, his voice rising again. "It's part of the birthright. She had to earn it. I was born into it. But somehow, she gets more respect than I do." The truth of Thomas's resentment was finally emerging. Eleanor realized that this wasn't really about Catherine at all. It was about Thomas's own insecurity about his position in the royal family. James seemed to reach the same conclusion. "Thomas, your position in this family has never been in question. You are Mother's son, which makes you my brother in every way that matters. But your behavior is jeopardizing that position." "My behavior?" Thomas's voice cracked slightly. "What about the fact that I have no real role, no real purpose? Catherine gets to be the future queen, but what am I supposed to be?" Eleanor felt the conversation shifting into territory that might actually be productive. Thomas's outburst was revealing deeper issues that needed to be addressed. "Thomas," she said carefully, Your role in this family is what you make of it. But that role must be built on respect for other family members and support for the institution we all serve. Thomas slumped against the door frame, the fight seeming to go out of him. I don't know how to do that, he admitted quietly. I don't know how to be anything other than the spare's spare. Eleanor and James exchanged glances. This vulnerable admission was perhaps the first honest thing Thomas had said in days. James moved closer to his stepbrother, his posture softening slightly. Thomas, you could have a meaningful role in this family if you chose to embrace it rather than resent it. But that starts with treating Catherine and everyone else with respect. Thomas looked up at James, and Eleanor could see the younger man's desperate need for acceptance and guidance. I've made a mess of things, haven't I? Thomas said quietly. Eleanor saw an opportunity to move the conversation in a constructive direction. Yes, Thomas, you have. But mistakes can be corrected if you're willing to do the work required. What work? Thomas asked, looking genuinely confused. James answered. Formal apologies to Catherine, to Lady Pemberton and the charity board, and to the palace guards who had to deal with your behavior last night. A commitment to conduct yourself appropriately at all royal functions. And perhaps most importantly, a genuine effort to support Catherine rather than undermine her. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, processing what was being asked of him. Eleanor could see him weighing his options and considering the consequences of his choices. And if I do all that? He asked finally. Then you remain a valued member of this family, Eleanor said. But Thomas, this is your last opportunity. There won't be another chance to make this right. Thomas nodded slowly, seeming to understand the gravity of his situation. I'll need help, he admitted. I don't know how to be better at this. James placed a hand on his stepbrother's shoulder. Then ask for help, Thomas. We're family. But you have to want to change, not just avoid consequences. As the immediate crisis seemed to diffuse, Eleanor felt cautiously optimistic. Thomas's admission of his struggles and his request for help suggested that there might be hope for improvement. There's one more thing, James said. You'll need to speak with Mother. She's been defending your behavior because she loves you, but she deserves to know that you understand you were wrong. Thomas's face paled at this suggestion. She's going to be disappointed in me. Yes, Eleanor said gently but firmly. She probably will be. But she'll also be proud of you for taking responsibility and trying to make things right. Thomas stood straighter, seeming to gather his resolve. I should go find Catherine first. I owe her the biggest apology. James smiled for the first time since entering Eleanor's sitting room. Yes, you do. But Thomas, make sure it's a real apology. Not an explanation of why you did what you did, but a genuine acknowledgement that what you did was wrong. Thomas nodded and turned to leave, but paused at the door. Aunt Eleanor, he said, using the title he had avoided during their confrontations. Thank you for not giving up on me completely. Eleanor smiled warmly. Thomas, family doesn't give up on family, but family also doesn't enable destructive behavior. Remember that going forward. As Thomas left, Eleanor and James stood in comfortable silence for a moment, processing what had just occurred. Do you think he means it? James asked. Eleanor considered the question carefully. I think he wants to mean it, which is a start. Whether he can follow through will depend on his willingness to do the hard work of changing his attitudes and behaviors. James nodded thoughtfully. I should go find Catherine and prepare her for Thomas's apology. She deserves to know it's coming and to be ready for it. That's wise, Eleanor agreed. And James, you handled that very well. You were firm when necessary but compassionate when possible. That's exactly the kind of leadership this family needs. As James left to find his wife, Eleanor settled back into her chair by the window. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower, casting longer shadows across the palace grounds. The crisis wasn't over yet. There would still be difficult conversations with Isabel, formal apologies to be delivered, and the ongoing work of rebuilding family relationships. But for the first time since this situation began, Eleanor felt genuinely hopeful that the royal family might emerge from this crisis stronger rather than more divided. Thomas's moment of vulnerability and honesty suggested that beneath his entitled behavior was a young man who simply needed guidance and purpose. Time would tell whether that hope was justified, But Eleanor had learned to appreciate small victories in the complex world of royal family dynamics. The following morning brought an unexpected sense of anticipation to the palace. Eleanor had slept better than she had in several days, though she remained cautiously optimistic about the resolution of the family crisis. Her morning routine was interrupted by a gentle knock at her door, followed by the entry of her personal maid, Sarah, who had served the royal household for nearly 20 years.
Good morning, my lady,
Sarah said, carrying Eleanor's morning tea service. I thought you should know that there's been quite a bit of activity in the palace this morning. Eleanor accepted her tea gratefully, noting Sarah's carefully neutral expression. The household staff had their own network of communication, and Sarah's updates often provided valuable insight into the mood of the palace. What sort of activity? Eleanor asked. Prince Thomas was seen early this morning in the florist section of the gardens, my lady. He spent considerable time selecting flowers. The head gardener mentioned that he seemed quite serious about making proper choices. Eleanor felt a flutter of hope. Thomas choosing flowers suggested he was preparing for a meaningful apology rather than a perfunctory one. And the crown princess? How has she seemed this morning? Composed but alert, my lady. Prince James was with her at breakfast, and they appeared to be having an important conversation. Her lady's maid mentioned that Her Royal Highness requested her most formal day dress. This detail was significant. Catherine's choice to dress formally suggested she understood the importance of the day's events and was prepared to receive Thomas's apology with appropriate dignity. Eleanor finished her tea and chose her own attire carefully. Today would require the perfect balance of authority and approachability, formality and family warmth. She selected a deep blue dress with pearl accessories, elegant but not intimidating. As she made her way through the palace corridors, Eleanor noticed that the staff seemed unusually attentive to their duties. Word had clearly spread that something significant was happening, and everyone wanted to ensure that their part of the royal household was functioning flawlessly. She encountered Sergeant Morrison near the main staircase, and his subtle nod indicated that the security situation had remained calm overnight. This was a relief. Thomas's previous late-night visit to the palace had created additional concerns about his judgment and self-control. Eleanor's destination was the blue drawing room, where Catherine had indicated she would be available to receive Thomas's apology. The choice of location was significant, formal enough to emphasize the seriousness of the situation, but still within the family quarters rather than the staterooms. As she approached the drawing room, Eleanor could hear voices inside. She paused to listen, recognizing James's deeper tones alternating with Catherine's more musical voice. Their conversation seemed calm, which suggested that Catherine felt prepared for what was to come. Eleanor knocked gently and entered to find the crown prince and princess seated together on one of the elegant sofas, their heads bent over what appeared to be official correspondence. Catherine looked up with a smile that seemed more relaxed than Eleanor had seen in days. Eleanor, Catherine said, rising to greet her. Perfect timing. We were just discussing the schedule for today. James also stood, and Eleanor was pleased to see that he looked more at ease as well. Thomas sent word that he would like to meet with Catherine at 10 o'clock. He requested that you be present as well, Aunt Eleanor. Eleanor felt touched by this request. Thomas's desire for her presence suggested that he valued her guidance and perhaps saw her as someone who could help ensure the conversation remained constructive. Of course, Eleanor said. How are you feeling about this, Catherine? Catherine considered the question thoughtfully, nervous but also hopeful. James helped me understand that this conversation is important not just for resolving the current situation, but for establishing how family conflicts will be handled in the future. This was exactly the perspective Eleanor had hoped Catherine would develop. Understanding the broader implications of personal interactions was crucial for someone in her position. Has Thomas given any indication of what he plans to say? Eleanor asked James, only that he wants to make a proper apology. He also asked if he could speak with you privately after his conversation with Catherine. He seemed to want guidance about how to approach Mother. Eleanor nodded. Isabel's reaction to Thomas's apology would be crucial for the family's healing process. If she could see his change as genuine growth rather than forced compliance, it would help restore family harmony. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. James called for entry and a footman appeared. Your Royal Highness's Lady Eleanor, the footman said with a bow. Prince Thomas has arrived and requests permission to enter. Eleanor felt her heart rate increase slightly. This moment would reveal whether Thomas's vulnerability from yesterday had translated into genuine change or merely strategic behavior. "Please show him in," Catherine said, her voice steady and clear. Thomas entered the room carrying a beautiful bouquet of white roses and purple irises, a combination that Eleanor recognized as symbolizing both new beginnings and sincere regret. His appearance was markedly different from the disheveled young man who had burst into Eleanor's sitting room the day before. He wore a well-tailored dark suit, his hair was properly styled, and his bearing suggested serious purpose rather than casual entitlement. "Catherine," Thomas said, approaching the crown princess with careful respect, "thank you for agreeing to see me." Catherine inclined her head gracefully. "Thomas, please, sit down." Eleanor noted that Catherine had positioned herself in the chair that commanded the most authoritative position in the room, a subtle but important assertion of her status. Thomas took the chair opposite her, placing the flowers on the side table. "I brought these for you," Thomas said, indicating the bouquet. "White roses for new beginnings, and irises for the courage I should have shown in supporting you rather than undermining you." Eleanor was impressed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Thomas had clearly put considerable thought into his apology. "They're beautiful," Catherine said sincerely. "Thank you." Thomas took a deep breath, and Eleanor could see him gathering his courage for what needed to be said. "Catherine, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond the flowers or even beyond words. My behavior over the past week has been inexcusable. I questioned your character publicly at the charity luncheon. I attempted to override security protocols to access your private quarters, and I made disrespectful comments about you to palace staff." Eleanor was pleased by the specificity of his acknowledgement. This wasn't a vague apology, but a detailed accounting of his inappropriate behavior, Thomas continued. "But more than that, I've been disrespectful to your position as crown princess and future queen. I let my own insecurities and resentment cloud my judgment about what this family requires from all of us." Catherine listened attentively, her expression remaining neutral but not cold. Eleanor could see that she was evaluating not just Thomas's words, but his sincerity. "Thomas," Catherine said when he paused, "I appreciate your apology, and I can see that you've given this serious thought. But I need to understand, what's changed? What makes you think your behavior will be different going forward?" The question was direct and fair. Eleanor admired Catherine's refusal to simply accept the apology without seeking understanding of what would prevent future incidents. Thomas looked down at his hands for a moment, clearly struggling with how to articulate his internal process. "I realized yesterday that I've been acting like a child who's angry about not getting enough attention. But I'm not a child anymore. And this family isn't about getting attention, it's about service. You understand that in a way I never allowed myself to understand." He looked up at Catherine directly. "You've dedicated yourself to your royal duties because you believe in the institution and want to contribute to it. I've been resentful of my royal duties because I felt they were limiting my freedom. That's a fundamental difference in character, and I need to change." Eleanor felt cautiously impressed by Thomas's self-reflection. This level of insight suggested genuine understanding rather than merely strategic apologizing. Catherine leaned forward slightly. "Thomas, I want to accept your apology, but I need to know that you understand why your behavior was so problematic. It wasn't just that you hurt my feelings, though you did. It was that you undermined my authority in front of people who need to see a unified royal family." "I understand that now," Thomas said earnestly. "When I questioned your suitability at the charity luncheon, I wasn't just expressing personal opinion. I was creating doubt about the stability of the succession. That was damaging to the institution we're supposed to serve." Eleanor exchanged a quick glance with James, who had remained silent during this exchange but whose expression showed satisfaction with Thomas's understanding. "There's something else," Thomas continued. "I want you to know that I've asked Aunt Eleanor to help me find a more meaningful role within the family's charitable works. I realize now that my resentment partly came from feeling useless, but that's my responsibility to address constructively." This was news to Eleanor, though it pleased her enormously. Thomas's desire to channel his energy into productive service suggested real growth. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, considering everything Thomas had said. Eleanor could see her weighing the sincerity of his words against the damage his behavior had caused. "Thomas," Catherine said finally, "I accept your apology. More than that, I want to work with you to ensure that this family can function with mutual respect and support." Thomas's relief was visible, but Catherine continued speaking. "However, I need you to understand that rebuilding trust will take time. Your actions have consequences that extend beyond this conversation, and proving that you've truly changed will require consistent behavior over an extended period." "I understand," Thomas said solemnly. "I don't expect immediate forgiveness or trust. I just hope for the opportunity to earn both through my future actions." Eleanor felt that this was the perfect moment to speak. "Thomas, the fact that you recognize the need to earn trust rather than simply expecting it shows real maturity. That's an excellent foundation for moving forward." James finally spoke, his voice carrying both relief and caution. "Thomas, I'm proud of you for taking responsibility like this. But Catherine is right. This is just the beginning of rebuilding our family relationships." Thomas nodded, then turned back to Catherine. "Is there anything specific I can do to begin making amends? Any particular way I can demonstrate my commitment to supporting you and your role?" Catherine considered this question thoughtfully. "Actually, there is. The charity luncheon where this all began, they're planning a follow-up event next month. I think it would be meaningful if you were to attend and make it clear to the board members that you fully support my initiatives." Eleanor thought this was a brilliant suggestion. It would require Thomas to demonstrate his change in the same setting where he had created the problem, in front of the same people who had witnessed his disrespectful behavior. "I would be honored to attend and support you publicly," Thomas said without hesitation. "And I will personally apologize to Lady Pemberton and the other board members who witnessed my inappropriate comments." "That would be very appreciated," Catherine said warmly. Eleanor felt that the immediate crisis had been successfully resolved, but she knew that the harder work was yet to come. Thomas would need to sustain this attitude through the inevitable challenges and frustrations of royal life. "Thomas," Eleanor said, "you mentioned wanting to speak with me privately about approaching your mother. I think that conversation would be valuable." Thomas's expression grew more serious. "Yes, I'm dreading that conversation, but I know it's necessary. She's been defending my behavior because she loves me, but she deserves to know that I was wrong." Catherine stood, signaling that the formal apology portion of the meeting was complete. "Thomas, thank you for coming today and for your sincerity. I look forward to seeing how we can work together going forward." Thomas rose as well, extending his hand to Catherine. She shook it firmly, a gesture that symbolized their mutual commitment to moving forward constructively. As Thomas prepared to leave with Eleanor for their private conversation, James approached his stepbrother. "Thomas, I want you to know how proud I am of the way you handled this. This is exactly the kind of leadership our family needs from all its members." Eleanor felt a warm satisfaction as she prepared to help Thomas navigate the challenging conversation with his mother. The royal family had weathered this crisis and emerged stronger, but the real test would be whether these positive changes could be sustained over time. Eleanor and Thomas walked together through the quieter corridors of the palace toward her private sitting room. The morning light streaming through the tall windows created patterns on the ancient carpet, and Eleanor noticed that Thomas seemed more relaxed than she had seen him in weeks. His successful apology to Catherine appeared to have lifted a considerable weight from his shoulders. "I'm proud of how you handled that conversation with Catherine," Eleanor said as they reached her sitting room. "Your apology was specific, sincere, and showed real understanding of the impact of your actions." Thomas smiled, but it was tinged with apprehension. "Thank you, Aunt Eleanor, but I have to admit, I'm terrified about speaking with Mother. She's been so defensive of me, and now I have to tell her that her defense was misplaced." Eleanor settled into her favorite chair while Thomas chose the seat across from her. She could see the young man's internal struggle written across his features, the desire to do right warring with his fear of disappointing the person who had always been his strongest advocate. "Thomas," Eleanor said gently, "your mother's defense of you came from love, not blindness. When you explain to her what you've learned about yourself and your behavior, she'll understand. She may be disappointed that you acted poorly, but she'll be proud that you've taken responsibility." Thomas leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. But what if she feels that I'm betraying her by admitting I was wrong? She's spent so much energy defending my actions. Eleanor considered this concern carefully. Isabel's reaction would indeed be crucial for the family's complete healing. Thomas, your mother is an intelligent and principled woman. She defended you because she believed you were being treated unfairly. When you show her that you understand your behavior was inappropriate, you're not betraying her. You're proving that her love and guidance helped you grow into someone capable of taking responsibility. This perspective seemed to ease some of Thomas's anxiety. Eleanor could see him processing this reframe of the situation. "How should I approach the conversation?" Thomas asked. "I don't want to make things worse between her and Catherine, or between her and you." Eleanor appreciated his consideration for the broader family dynamics. "Be honest about your own actions and your own realizations. Don't make it about family politics or who was right or wrong in defending you. Make it about your personal growth and your commitment to doing better." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Eleanor called for entry, and her maid Sarah appeared. "My lady," Sarah said respectfully, "Queen Consort Isabel is requesting to see Prince Thomas. She's in her private sitting room and asks if he might attend her at his convenience." Eleanor and Thomas exchanged glances. The timing was both fortuitous and nerve-wracking. Thomas wouldn't have to initiate the difficult conversation, but he also couldn't delay it further. "Tell Her Majesty that Prince Thomas will attend her shortly," Eleanor said. After Sarah departed, Thomas took a deep breath. "I suppose there's no point in postponing this." "No," Eleanor agreed. "And honestly, it's better this way. You won't have time to work yourself into greater anxiety about it." Thomas stood, straightening his jacket with nervous energy. "Aunt Eleanor, would you be available afterward, in case I need someone to talk to about how it goes?" Eleanor was touched by his request for support. "Of course, Thomas. Whatever happens with your mother, remember that you've already done the hard work of acknowledging your mistakes and making amends. That takes real courage." As Thomas left for what promised to be one of the most difficult conversations of his life, Eleanor reflected on the remarkable changes she had witnessed in him over the past 2 days. The entitled young man who had burst into her sitting room in anger had been replaced by someone genuinely seeking to understand his responsibilities and grow from his mistakes. Eleanor spent the next hour handling correspondence, but her attention was divided. She found herself listening for sounds from the corridor that might indicate how Thomas's conversation with his mother was progressing. The palace seemed unusually quiet, as if the very building was holding its breath, waiting for the outcome of this crucial family discussion. Finally, nearly 90 minutes after he had departed, Thomas returned to Eleanor's sitting room. His appearance immediately told her that the conversation had been emotionally intensive. His eyes were slightly red, and his composed demeanor from earlier had given way to something more raw and vulnerable. "How did it go?" Eleanor asked gently, indicating that he should sit down. Thomas slumped into the chair across from her, running his hands through his hair. "It was awful and wonderful at the same time," he said with a shaky laugh. Eleanor waited for him to elaborate, understanding that he needed time to process what had occurred. "I told her everything," Thomas continued, "about my behavior at the charity luncheon, about trying to access Catherine's quarters, about my comments to the guards. And I explained that I had been wrong, completely and utterly wrong." "How did she respond?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with his emotions. "She cried," he said finally. "She said she had been so afraid that I was being treated unfairly that she hadn't allowed herself to see that I was behaving badly." Eleanor felt a mixture of sadness for Isabel's pain and relief that she had been able to accept the truth about her son's behavior. "But then," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger, "she said she was proud of me. She said that taking responsibility like this showed that I had grown into the kind of man she had always hoped I would become." Eleanor smiled warmly. "That sounds exactly like something Isabel would say. She's always been able to see the best in people, especially you." "She also said something else," Thomas added, looking directly at Eleanor. "She said that she owed apologies too, to you and to Catherine, for defending behavior that shouldn't have been defended." Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy for Isabel. The queen consort's position in the family had always required careful navigation, and her protective instincts regarding Thomas had placed her in an impossible situation. "Your mother doesn't owe anyone apologies for loving her son," Eleanor said firmly. "Her instinct to protect you was natural and right. The problem was never her defense of you. It was your behavior that required defending." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "That's essentially what I told her, but she insists on speaking with Catherine personally to clear the air between them." Eleanor thought this was probably wise. While Catherine had been understanding about the family dynamics involved, a direct conversation with Isabel would help ensure that no lingering resentment affected their future relationship. "And how are you feeling now?" Eleanor asked. That was an enormous emotional undertaking. Thomas considered the question carefully. "Exhausted," he admitted, "but also relieved. And maybe for the first time in years, I feel like I actually belong in this family rather than just being tolerated by it." Eleanor was struck by this admission. Thomas's sense of not belonging had clearly been driving much of his problematic behavior, and addressing it directly was crucial for his future development. "Thomas, you have always belonged in this family, but belonging comes with responsibilities that you're now ready to embrace." Speaking of responsibilities, Thomas said, "I meant what I said to Catherine about wanting to find more meaningful work within the family's charitable activities. Can you help me with that?" Eleanor felt pleased by his continued focus on constructive action. "In fact, I think your experience with feeling like an outsider might make you particularly effective in working with young people who are struggling to find their place in the world." Thomas's eyes lit up at this suggestion. That's actually something I could be passionate about. Working with young people who feel lost or without purpose." Eleanor began to envision possibilities for Thomas's future role. His charm and charisma, properly directed, could be tremendous assets in charitable work. More importantly, his personal experience with feelings of displacement and resentment could help him connect authentically with people facing similar challenges. "We'll need to discuss this with the Queen and with the palace's charitable works coordinator," Eleanor said. "But I think there's real potential for you to develop a meaningful and impactful role." Their conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door. This time, James entered without waiting for permission, his expression urgent but not alarmed. "Thomas," James said, "Grandmother would like to see both of us in her study. She wants to discuss the resolution of this situation and our plans for moving forward." Eleanor felt that this was an excellent development. The Queen's desire to meet with both brothers suggested that she was satisfied with the way the crisis had been resolved and was ready to focus on preventing future problems. "Should I be nervous about this meeting?" Thomas asked James. James smiled. "No more nervous than usual when meeting with Grandmother. She appreciates that you've taken responsibility for your actions, but she'll want to ensure that the lessons learned are permanent ones." As the brothers prepared to leave for their meeting with the Queen, Thomas turned back to Eleanor. "Aunt Eleanor, thank you for everything, for standing up to me when I needed it, for supporting Catherine when she needed it, and for helping me find a path forward when I was completely lost." Eleanor felt a warm satisfaction at seeing the genuine gratitude in Thomas's expression. "Thomas, that's what family does for each other. We challenge each other to be better, and we support each other through the process of growth." After James and Thomas departed, Eleanor settled back into her chair with a cup of tea and reflected on the events of the past few days. The royal family had weathered a serious crisis that could have created lasting divisions and damaged relationships. Instead, through honest communication and a willingness to hold people accountable while still offering support, they had emerged stronger. Catherine had established herself as someone who commanded respect and wouldn't tolerate disrespectful behavior, but who was also gracious in accepting genuine apologies and offering opportunities for redemption. Thomas had learned that his position in the family came with responsibilities as well as privileges, and that his actions had consequences that extended beyond himself. Perhaps most importantly, the family had demonstrated that conflicts could be resolved through direct confrontation of inappropriate behavior rather than allowing problems to fester beneath the surface. This established precedents that would serve them well in future challenges. Eleanor's contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine, who knocked gently before entering the sitting room. "I hope I'm not intruding," Catherine said, "but I wanted to thank you personally for everything you've done over the past few days." Eleanor gestured for Catherine to join her, pleased by the visit. "My dear, you handled yourself beautifully throughout this entire situation. You showed exactly the kind of strength and grace that will serve you well as queen." Catherine smiled, settling into the chair Thomas had recently vacated. "I have to admit, there were moments when I doubted myself. When Thomas was questioning my suitability so publicly, it brought up all my old insecurities about whether I really belonged in this family." Eleanor studied Catherine's face, noting the vulnerability in her expression. "And what convinced you that you do belong?" "Watching you stand up for what was right regardless of the personal cost," Catherine said without hesitation. "You showed me that belonging in this family isn't about birth or breeding, it's about dedication to the institution and the principles it represents." Eleanor felt deeply moved by this assessment. "Catherine, you understood those principles long before I reinforced them. You just needed to trust your own judgment." "Perhaps," Catherine said, "but having your support made all the difference in my confidence to act on that judgment." As the afternoon sun began to slant lower through the windows, Eleanor reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. The crisis that had begun with Thomas's inappropriate comments at a charity luncheon had evolved into an opportunity for family growth and stronger relationships. "There's one more thing," Catherine said as she prepared to leave. "Isabel has asked to meet with me tomorrow morning. She wants to discuss how we can work together more effectively going forward." Eleanor was pleased but not surprised by this development. Isabel's willingness to address the situation directly, rather than allowing awkwardness to persist, showed her commitment to family harmony. "That conversation will be important for both of you," Eleanor said. "Isabel is a good woman who was placed in an impossible position by Thomas's behavior. Now that he's taken responsibility, she can focus on building positive relationships rather than defending problematic actions." As Catherine departed, Eleanor felt a deep sense of satisfaction with how the crisis had been resolved. The royal family had demonstrated that they could handle internal conflicts with wisdom, fairness, and ultimately, love for each other. The evening light filtering through her windows reminded Eleanor that this was just one chapter in the ongoing story of the royal family. There would be other challenges, other conflicts that would test their relationships and their commitment to the institution they served. But the precedents established during this crisis, the importance of accountability, the value of honest communication, and the power of forgiveness combined with genuine change, would serve them well in whatever challenges lay ahead. Eleanor picked up her evening correspondence with renewed energy, confident that the royal family was stronger than ever and ready to face the future with unity and purpose.